There are conversations that happen without a single word being spoken, dialogues conducted in the subtle dialect of proximity and silence. They are arguably the most honest conversations you will ever have. For months, Julian and I had been fluent in this unspoken language, our evenings a long, drawn-out sentence punctuated by the soft glow of the television screen. But tonight, he had added a new word to our lexicon, one that landed with the quiet, definitive weight of a closing door. He had been staring at the swirling patterns of the wooden floorboards, his shoulders slumped in a way that had become achingly familiar, a cartography of exhaustion I had learned to read with perfect accuracy. The apartment was still, holding the late-night hum of the city at bay, and in that stillness, he finally spoke, his voice a low murmur that seemed to cling to the air like dust motes in a sunbeam. He said he missed when we talked for hours. And then, without waiting for a reply, he shifted on the couch, a small, almost imperceptible movement that closed the final inch of carefully maintained distance between us, and sat close enough for our knees to touch. The point of contact was electric, a tiny starburst of heat that radiated up my leg and settled deep in my chest, a warm, heavy stone of pure, unadulterated panic. My entire consciousness collapsed into that single, infinitesimal point of pressure, the worn denim of his jeans against the soft cotton of my sweatpants. It was nothing. It was everything. The paradox of his statement hung in the air between us, a shimmering, impossible thing. We lived together. We shared coffee in the morning and muttered greetings in the evening. We talked every single day, our conversations a steady, reliable rhythm of logistical updates and mundane observations about work, the weather, the dwindling supply of milk in the fridge. But he was right. We didn't talk. Not in the way we used to, back when the architecture of our friendship was first being built, back when we would stay up until the sky began to bleed with the pale light of dawn, mapping out our futures, dissecting our fears, and building a world that belonged only to us. Those conversations had been the foundation, the load-bearing walls of everything we were. And somewhere along the way, without me ever noticing the exact moment it happened, they had stopped. The house was still standing, but the lights had been turned off, one by one, leaving us to navigate the familiar rooms in a comfortable but profound darkness. His words were an admission of that darkness, a quiet acknowledgement of the distance that had grown even as our physical lives became more entwined. But his action, the simple, deliberate act of closing that gap, was a contradiction. It was a plea and a statement all at once. The touch was a new kind of dialogue, one that bypassed words entirely and spoke directly to the terrified, hopeful thing that lived in my ribcage. It felt like a question being asked in a language I had only ever dreamed of speaking. For years, I had been the silent observer of my own life, a photographer cataloging the beautiful, untouchable world of Julian from a safe and respectful distance. My feelings for him were a collection of secret photographs, developed in the darkroom of my own mind, too fragile and overexposed to ever be brought into the light. I had built fortress walls around my heart, so high and so thick that I had convinced myself they were impenetrable. Friendship was the name I gave the space between those walls and him, a wide, open country where we could coexist safely, without the risk of collision. But with that one small movement, that gentle press of his knee against mine, he had crossed the border. He had walked right up to the gate of the fortress, and with the quietest touch, he had just proven that there was no lock at all. The silence that followed was immense, filled with the thunderous sound of my own pulse and the weight of 100 unasked questions. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just sat there, feeling the warmth of his leg against mine, and understood that the foundations of our world were beginning to shift, and I had no idea if the structure would hold. We had met in a sea of noise and nervous energy, the chaotic ecosystem of a university orientation week. I was trying to make myself as small as possible, a chameleon against the brick wall of the student union, my camera clutched in my hand like a shield. It was my first attempt at documentary photography for the campus paper, and I was failing spectacularly, too intimidated by the sheer volume of humanity to lift the lens to my eye. And then there was Julian. He was not a part of the chaos. He was the chaos, a vibrant center of gravity pulling everyone into his orbit. He was a swimmer, and he moved with the easy, unthinking grace of someone whose body was a finely tuned instrument. He was laughing, a bright, unrestrained sound that cut through the drone of the crowd, his hair catching the late afternoon sun like spun gold. He was everything I was not: loud, confident, incandescently alive. I remember thinking he was like a force of nature, a summer thunderstorm you could only stand back and admire. I certainly never expected the storm to turn and head directly for me. He had noticed my camera, of course. It was his way in. He bounded over, his smile so wide and genuine it was disarming, and started asking questions. Not about the camera's specs or the technical details, the way most people did, but about what I saw, what I was trying to capture. He leaned in close to look at the tiny display screen, and I remember the clean, sharp scent of chlorine and something uniquely him, something warm and alive. I was stammering and used to being the focus of such direct, undiluted attention. But he didn't seem to notice my awkwardness. Or if he did, he didn't care. He just listened, his blue eyes fixed on my face with an intensity that made me feel, for the first time in a long time, truly seen. He saw past the quiet, nervous facade and seemed to glimpse the person I kept carefully hidden underneath. He didn't see an introverted loner. He saw an artist. He saw a storyteller. And in that moment, a friendship was forged in the crucible of his relentless, effervescent curiosity. That friendship became the defining relationship of my college years and of my life. Julian, with his boundless energy, pulled me out of my shell. He dragged me to parties where I would linger in the corners, camera in hand, and he would always find his way back to me, bringing me a drink, introducing me to people, anchoring me in his steady orbit. He made my quietness feel not like a flaw, but like a strength, a superpower. He'd say, "Leo, you see things. You see the real stuff." And in turn, I offered him a space of quiet. Our dorm rooms, and later our shared off-campus apartment, became a sanctuary for him, a place where the performer could rest. He was the star of the swim team, constantly under pressure to perform, to be on. With me, he could be quiet. He could be tired. He could be vulnerable. I learned to read the subtle shifts in his mood, the slight downturn of his mouth that signaled a grueling practice, the tension in his shoulders that spoke of academic stress. I learned the geography of his silences as well as he had learned the language of my own. My feelings, the ones I kept locked away, began to develop slowly, like a photograph in a chemical bath. There wasn't a single, cataclysmic moment of realization, but rather a series of small, quiet epiphanies. It was watching him from the stands during a swim meet, seeing him slice through the water with such power and grace, a fleeting, beautiful thing of muscle and motion. It was the time he fell asleep on a pile of textbooks in the library, his face peaceful and unguarded in the soft light, and I felt an overwhelming urge to smooth the hair back from his forehead. But the moment the image truly came into focus, the moment I could no longer deny the truth of it, was during our junior year. He had just won a major championship, the final, decisive race that had clinched the title for the university. The pool deck was chaos, a shouting, splashing, jubilant mess. He hoisted himself out of the water, water streaming from his body, and stood there for a second, gasping for air, a look of pure, unadulterated triumph on his face. The stadium lights caught the droplets on his skin, making him glitter. He scanned the crowd, his eyes searching, and when they found me, he broke into that impossibly wide, brilliant smile. And in that instant, my heart didn't just flutter, it broke open. It was a profound, gut-wrenching ache of affection so pure and so powerful it terrified me. It wasn't just friendship. It was love. A hopeless, impossible love for my very straight, very popular, very best friend. I took that photograph in my mind and buried it. I buried it deep. The fear of losing him was a physical thing, a cold dread that coiled in my stomach at the mere thought of him ever finding out. Our friendship was too precious, too essential to my existence. It was the central pillar holding up the entire structure of my life. To risk it for a feeling he could never reciprocate felt like a form of self-destruction. So I became a master of compartmentalization. I built a room inside myself where my love for Julian lived, and I kept the door firmly locked. I dated other people, half-heartedly. I listened to him talk about the girls he was seeing, offering advice, playing the part of the supportive best friend with an Oscar-worthy performance of platonic affection. I was there when he met Sarah. Sarah was lovely. She was smart, funny, and she adored Julian in a way that was both obvious and completely understandable. They made sense together. They looked like the couple on top of a wedding cake, a perfect, gleaming image of happiness. And I was happy for him, I truly was. But it was a happiness tinged with a quiet, persistent melancholy, the low-grade ache of a phantom limb. I watched them build a life together, their relationship a tangible thing that occupied the space around us. I became an expert at navigating the careful choreography of being the third wheel, the permanent, friendly fixture in the background of their love story. I photographed their good times, my camera a convenient excuse to be present but separate, an observer documenting a world I could never truly be a part of. Julian never wavered in his friendship. He carved out time for me, ensuring our bond remained intact, blissfully unaware of the silent calculations I was making every time we were all together, the constant, exhausting effort of keeping my own heart in check. The years passed like this, a steady rhythm of unspoken feelings and carefully maintained boundaries, until the day the music of their relationship simply faded out. The breakup was not a dramatic, crashing chord, but a slow decrescendo into silence. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, no tearful recriminations. From what I could gather, it was a mutual decision, a quiet, sad acknowledgement that they had grown into two different people who wanted two different things. Sarah was offered a dream job on the other side of the country, and Julian, whose entire world was built here, couldn't imagine leaving. It was a divergence of paths, a practical, heartbreaking end to a long and loving chapter. Julian announced it to me one evening over a takeout pizza, his voice flat, his gaze fixed on the television. He delivered the news with the emotional detachment of a newscaster reporting on distant events. "Sarah and I broke up," he said, and then he took a bite of his slice, as if commenting on the weather. But I knew him better than that. I could see the fracture lines beneath the calm surface. In the weeks that followed, he didn't talk about it. He didn't mourn or rage or seek my counsel. Instead, he just deflated. The bright, incandescent energy that had always defined him seemed to dim, the light pulling back deep inside him, leaving his eyes shadowed and his movements slow. He was like a ship that had been expertly scuttled, sinking quietly beneath the waves without a single ripple to mark its descent. He was unmoored, adrift in the placid, terrifying waters of a future he had not planned for. The life he had been so carefully constructing with Sarah for 5 years had been dismantled overnight, leaving behind an empty plot of land and a set of blueprints for a house that would never be built. He was profoundly, deeply lonely, but he didn't have the words to say it. So he began to speak in the language of proximity. He had always been a physical person, quick with a clap on the shoulder or a playful shove, but this was different. This was quieter, more needy. He started to gravitate towards me, a silent satellite falling into a new, more powerful gravitational pull. Our two-bedroom apartment, which had always had clearly defined territories, his room, my room, and the shared spaces in between, began to feel like a single, unified territory. He stopped closing his bedroom door. He would work on his laptop at the kitchen island while I cooked, not speaking, just coexisting in the same pocket of air. If I was in the living room, reading or editing photos, he would inevitably find a reason to be there too, sinking into the other end of the couch, his presence a quiet, constant weight. He was seeking harbor, I realized. His own port had been decommissioned, and he was drifting, exhausted, into mine, perhaps without even realizing he was doing it. I let him. I held the space for his silent grief, for his disorientation. I didn't push him to talk. I just continued our normal routines, making coffee for 2 in the morning, asking if he wanted anything from the grocery store, maintaining the steady, predictable rhythm of our shared life. I understood that this was his way of healing, of finding his bearings. He needed an anchor, and for whatever reason, he had chosen me. My own carefully guarded heart ached for him, for the quiet pain he was trying so hard to hide. The locked room inside me felt smaller, the walls thinner. The feelings I had kept contained for so long were stirring, woken by his newfound vulnerability. I told myself it was just friendship, that I was just being a good friend. It was a mantra I repeated over and over, a desperate attempt to keep the old boundaries intact, even as Julian himself began to erase them, one silent, tentative step at a time. The space between us was shrinking, the air growing thick with everything we weren't saying. I knew something had to give. I just prayed it wouldn't be me. The ritual began on a Tuesday. It was a miserable, rainy night, the kind of evening that seeps into your bones and makes the world feel gray and indistinct. Julian had come home from work looking like a ghost, his face pale, dark circles like bruises under his eyes. He'd had a brutal week, a high-pressure project with an impossible deadline, and the strain was visible in every line of his body. He'd barely eaten, just collapsed onto the couch with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the entire world. I had suggested a movie, one of our old, easy favorites, something that required no thought and promised a simple, predictable comfort. He had just grunted in agreement, his eyes already half closed. Halfway through the film, I felt a slow, encroaching warmth and a subtle pressure against my side. I glanced over. He had fallen asleep, his head slumping progressively closer until, with a final, soft surrender, it came to rest on my shoulder. My entire body went rigid. I held my breath, my muscles locking, terrified that the slightest movement would wake him. My first instinct was pure, unadulterated panic. This was a line. A clear, definitive line had been crossed, and I was on the wrong side of it. But the panic was quickly followed by something else, something softer and far more dangerous. A wave of profound, aching tenderness washed over me. He looked so young, so vulnerable, his face stripped of its usual confident mask, the tension smoothed away by sleep. His breathing was a soft, steady rhythm against my neck. I could smell the faint, clean scent of his shampoo. I sat there, a statue carved from anxiety and affection, for what must have been an hour and a half, until the movie ended and the credits rolled in silence. My arm was numb, my neck was cramping, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I was trapped, not by his weight, but by the overwhelming significance of the moment. This was a new level of trust, a new kind of intimacy he was offering, even if it was only being offered unconsciously, in the defenselessness of sleep. When he finally stirred, mumbling an apology and stumbling off to his own bed, he left behind a ghost of warmth on my shoulder and a roaring silence in the room. I thought it would be a one-time occurrence, an anomaly brought on by exhaustion and stress. I was wrong. A few nights later, it happened again, and then again the week after that. Movie nights became our new routine, an unspoken agreement. And each time, at some point, he would drift off, and his head would find its way to my shoulder, or his leg would press against mine, or he would shift until his entire side was flush against me. He never acknowledged it the next morning. It existed in a strange pocket of shared experience, a thing we both knew happened, but neither of us dared to name. It was our secret, held in the liminal space between waking and sleeping. His plausible deniability was perfect. He was just tired. He wasn't a good sleeper. The couch was comfortable. Any of these could be true. But in the quiet darkness of our living room, with only the flickering light of the screen for company, I began to believe it was something more. The ritual evolved slowly, organically, each new development a small escalation in this silent negotiation of our boundaries. One night, he shivered, a small, involuntary tremor, and without thinking, I pulled the throw blanket from the back of the couch and draped it over both of us. Under the cover of that shared warmth, he shifted even closer, tucking himself against my side like a child seeking comfort from a storm. My arm was resting on the back of the couch, and he guided it down, wrapping it around his own shoulders and settling in with a soft, contented sigh. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. I was holding him, not in a quick, friendly hug, but holding him, providing comfort, warmth, and a sense of safety. My arm, which a moment before had been my own, now belonged to him, a part of his landscape of sleep. I spent hours studying the way the light from the screen caught the curve of his ear, the way his eyelashes cast long shadows on his cheek, the slight, unconscious parting of his lips. I was memorizing him, cataloging every detail of these stolen moments of closeness, hoarding them like precious jewels. This new intimacy was both a heaven and a hell. It was a nightly exercise in exquisite torture. Every evening, I would anticipate it with a mix of breathless hope and stomach-churning dread. The hope was a dangerous, seductive whisper that told me this meant something, that his body was telling a truth his mind wasn't ready to acknowledge. The dread was the voice of reason, the cold, hard certainty that I was misinterpreting everything, that I was projecting my own years of buried longing onto simple, platonic acts of comfort between friends. I was walking a tightrope stretched between these two possibilities, terrified of falling. My life became a study in stillness. I learned to control my breathing, to sit for hours without shifting a muscle, to exist as a passive, comforting presence. I became a piece of furniture, a human pillow, and I did it gladly, because it was the only way I was allowed to have this. It was the only way I was allowed to be close to him, to feel the solid, living weight of him against me, to offer a comfort that went deeper than words. Our couch became a world unto itself, an island adrift in the quiet sea of our apartment. When we were there, cocooned in the low light and the soft murmur of the television, the rules of the outside world seemed to dissolve. There was no past, no future, only this extended, suspended moment of ambiguous closeness. The city lights beyond our window painted abstract patterns on the walls, but they felt a million miles away. My photography began to change. I found myself drawn to images of liminal spaces, doorways, windows, the moment between sunset and darkness. I was obsessed with the gray areas, the thresholds between one state and another, because that was where I was living. I was living in the doorway between friendship and something else, and I was terrified to step through, but even more terrified to step back. And then there were the moments of consciousness, the moments that truly undid me. Sometimes he wasn't fully asleep. I would feel him shift, a deliberate, waking movement, and press himself even closer. I would hear his breathing catch for a second before resuming its slow, even rhythm. Once, in a moment of what felt like impossible bravery or perhaps just sleep-addled instinct, his hand found mine under the blanket, his fingers loosely intertwining with my own. He didn't squeeze, didn't give any sign that it was a conscious gesture, but his hand was warm and solid around mine, and I felt a jolt, a current of pure, unadulterated shock that left me breathless. I lay there, our hands joined in the darkness, and felt a single, hot tear trace a path down my temple and into my hair. It was a tear of gratitude and of grief. Gratitude for this impossible, beautiful closeness, and grief for the fact that it could only exist here, in the shadows, under the guise of sleep and plausible deniability. I was a secret keeper, and the secret I was keeping was my own fragile, breaking heart. The ritual was no longer just a comfort for him. It had become a necessity for me. It was the air I breathed, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I was becoming addicted to the poison that was slowly, surely going to kill me. The breaking point arrived on a quiet Thursday. There was nothing remarkable about the day that preceded it. It was a simple, unassuming day that gave no hint of the seismic shift it was about to deliver. The ritual had been our norm for months now, a silent, nightly waltz we had perfected. The tension had become a living thing in our apartment, a third roommate that sat with us on the couch, its presence palpable in the charged silence. That night, we watched a film I can no longer remember, its plot and characters completely erased by the magnitude of what came after. The movie ended, the screen faded to black, and the sudden absence of light and sound was deafening. The only illumination came from the faint, ambient glow of the city filtering through the blinds, casting the room in a soft, ethereal light. For the first time, Julian didn't stir when the movie concluded. He remained perfectly still, his head resting on my chest, his body a warm, solid line against mine. The blanket was tangled around our legs, a soft, woolen anchor. The silence stretched, and it was different this time. It wasn't the comfortable, sleepy silence we were used to. It was awake. It was alert. I could feel the tension humming through him, a fine, high-frequency vibration. I could hear his breathing, which was no longer the deep, even rhythm of sleep, but something lighter, more conscious. My own heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, so loud I was sure he could feel its wild, terrified beat against his ear. I waited, frozen in a state of suspended animation, every nerve ending alight with a terrifying, exhilarating anticipation. The air was thick with unspoken words, with months of repressed feelings and unanswered questions. It felt like the moment before a storm breaks, the world holding its breath, waiting for the first drop of rain or the first crack of lightning. Then he moved. Slowly, Deliberately, he lifted his head from my chest. He didn't pull away completely, but shifted, propping himself up on one elbow so he could look at me. In the dim, forgiving light, his face was a landscape of shadows and soft edges. His eyes, usually so bright and clear, were dark pools of unreadable emotion. He just looked at me for a long, silent moment, and I felt as though he were seeing me for the very first time, as if he were looking past the friend, past the roommate, and seeing the man who had been holding his breath for nearly a decade. My own gaze was trapped by his, unable to look away, unable to hide. Everything I had ever felt for him felt exposed, laid bare under his quiet, intense scrutiny. His voice, when it came, was barely a whisper, a fragile sound that I felt more than heard. Leo. My own name felt foreign, a word from another language. I couldn't find my voice, so I just managed a small, almost imperceptible nod. My throat was tight, my mouth dry. He swallowed, a small, audible movement in the profound quiet of the room. He seemed to be gathering his courage, searching for words that were buried deep. "Can I ask you something?" Again, I just nodded, my heart climbing into my throat, choking me. This was it. This was the moment the tightrope would snap, the moment I would fall. I braced myself for the impact, for the kind words of rejection, for the gentle untangling of our lives that was sure to follow. I was preparing for the end. He hesitated for another heartbeat, his eyes searching mine, as if looking for permission, for a sign that it was safe to proceed. And then he spoke the words that shattered my world and rebuilt it all in the same instant. Would it be okay if I kissed you?" The question was so soft, so tentative, so completely unexpected that for a moment, I was sure I had imagined it. It was a fantasy I had entertained in the deepest, most secret corners of my mind, a line of dialogue from a movie I would never be in. But the look on his face was real. The vulnerability, the fear, the sliver of hope shining in his eyes, it was all real. The air left my lungs in a silent rush. Time seemed to warp and stretch, the space between his question and my answer an eternity. In that eternity, I saw the two paths laid out before me. I could retreat, make a joke, pretend he was half asleep and confused, and preserve the safe, painful status quo of our friendship. Or I could step off the cliff. I could choose the terrifying, beautiful freefall of honesty. I didn't answer with words. I couldn't. Instead, I lifted a trembling hand and gently cupped his jaw, my thumb stroking the faint stubble on his cheek. It was an answer and a confession all in one. His eyes fluttered shut at my touch, a silent sigh escaping his lips. And then he leaned in, closing the last remaining distance between us. The kiss was nothing like I had imagined. It wasn't a desperate, passionate collision. It was impossibly gentle, a soft, hesitant press of his lips against mine. It was a question, an exploration, a confession whispered in the language of touch. It was tentative and achingly sweet, full of all the uncertainty and fear and years of unspoken affection that had led us to this single, pivotal moment. It tasted of salt and longing. In that one, simple kiss, a decade of carefully constructed walls crumbled into dust, and for the first time, in the quiet darkness of our living room, I felt completely and utterly exposed. And I had never felt so free. The moment ended as quietly as it began. He pulled back, just an inch, his lips parting from mine, but his forehead came to rest against my own. His eyes remained closed. Neither of us spoke. The silence that filled the room now was different from all the silences that had come before it. It was not empty or awkward. It was heavy, laden with the weight of a new reality. A line had been crossed, a door had been opened, and there was no going back. I could feel the tremor in his hand, which was now resting on my chest, right over my wildly beating heart. He was trembling, or maybe we both were. But then, as the seconds ticked by, a new feeling began to bloom in the space between us. Panic. I could feel it radiating from him, a cold wave that pushed back against the warmth of the kiss. His body tensed, the soft vulnerability of a moment ago replaced by a sudden, rigid anxiety. He pulled away completely, scrambling to a sitting position on the other side of the couch, putting a chasm of space between us where there had just been none. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I knew was a tell for when he was deeply unsettled. He wouldn't look at me. He stared at his hands, at the floor, at the dark television screen, anywhere but at my face. The gentle, intimate atmosphere of a moment ago had evaporated, replaced by something sharp and brittle. The air crackled with his regret. I could feel it as surely as I had felt his lips on mine. I'm sorry, he stammered, his voice rough. I shouldn't have done that. I'm tired. I'm not thinking straight. The words were a physical blow. Tired. Not thinking straight. He was erasing it, trying to file it away under the same category of plausible deniability as all the nights of cuddling. He was taking the most honest moment of my life and labeling it a mistake. Before I could find the words to respond, to argue, to plead, he was on his feet. I should get to bed, he mumbled, and then he was gone, retreating down the short hallway to his bedroom. I heard his door click shut, a sound of finality that echoed the slamming of a vault. I was left alone on the couch, the island that had been our sanctuary now feeling like a place of shipwreck and desolation. The ghost of his kiss was still on my lips, a fading warmth that was quickly being consumed by a creeping, icy dread. I had been given a glimpse of heaven, and then had the gates slammed shut in my face. I sat there for hours, in the dark, replaying the moment over and over, trying to understand how something so beautiful could turn so sour, so quickly. The next few days were a masterclass in avoidance. The easy, comfortable silence that had once defined our shared space was replaced by a strained, agonizing quiet. The apartment, once a sanctuary, felt like a minefield. We moved around each other like ghosts, our paths carefully choreographed to avoid intersection. He was suddenly, inexplicably busy. He left for work before I woke up and came home late, after I had already retreated to my own room. When we did cross paths in the kitchen or the hallway, the encounters were brief and excruciatingly polite. He would offer a tight, forced smile that didn't reach his eyes and ask a generic question about my day before making a quick escape. He was treating me like a stranger, a polite but distant acquaintance. The warmth, the intimacy, the entire shared language we had built over months of quiet closeness. It had all vanished, as if it had never existed at all. The couch went unused. The television remained dark. The throw blanket lay neatly folded, a sad, woolen relic of a forgotten time. Every time I looked at it, I felt a fresh wave of grief. The pain was sharper, more acute than the dull ache of my years of silent longing. This was the pain of loss. I had been given something I never thought I could have, only to have it snatched away. The hope he had so carelessly ignited within me now felt like a cruel, elaborate joke. I began to question my own sanity. Had I imagined the tenderness in his kiss? Had I misinterpreted the desperate vulnerability in his eyes? He was making me believe that I had written an entire novel based on a single, meaningless word. My heart, which had felt so exposed and free, began to rebuild its walls, brick by painful brick. But this time, the walls were made of anger and hurt. I couldn't live like this. The cold war of silence in our own home was unbearable. I deserved more than this. The friendship we had, the decade of history we shared, deserved more than to be killed by a ghosting. After nearly a week of this torturous dance, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I needed an explanation. I needed the truth, no matter how much it hurt. I waited for him one night, my heart a cold, heavy knot in my stomach. I sat on the couch, our couch, and watched the clock on the wall tick away the minutes, each one a small eternity. When I finally heard his key in the lock, I took a deep, steadying breath. This was going to be the end of something, one way or another. He walked in, looking tired and surprised to see me. He started to offer his usual strained greeting and make a move towards his room, but I stopped him. "Julian, wait." My voice was calmer than I felt, steady and low. "We need to talk," he froze, his shoulders slumping in defeat. He knew he couldn't run this time. He avoided my eyes, dropping his bag to the floor and leaning against the wall. "Leo, I already said I was sorry. Can we just forget it happened?" "No," I said, the word sharper than I intended. I softened my tone. "No, we can't. Because it wasn't nothing to me, Julian. You can't just kiss me like that, after everything, after all these months, and then pretend it was a mistake because you were tired. That's not fair. To me. Or to you." He finally looked at me, and his face was a mess of conflict and misery. I could see the panic warring with a deep, profound sadness. "What do you want me to say?" he asked, his voice cracking. "I want you to tell me the truth," I said simply. Whatever it is. If you regret it, if you were just confused, if it was a mistake, I can handle it. I can. But what I can't handle is this. This silence. You acting like I don't exist. You're my best friend. And you're breaking my heart. The last words came out on a raw, vulnerable whisper, and I saw something in him break. His carefully constructed dam of avoidance and denial finally gave way. He slid down the wall until he was sitting on the floor, his head in his hands. His shoulders began to shake with silent, racking sobs. All my anger evaporated, replaced by that familiar, overwhelming wave of love and concern. I moved from the couch to the floor, sitting a few feet away from him, giving him space, but letting him know I was there. I waited. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with tears, muffled by his hands. "I'm not sorry I kissed you," he whispered. "I'm terrified." He lifted his head, and his eyes were red-rimmed and pleading. "I'm sorry because I ran away. I'm sorry because I'm a coward." He took a shuddering breath and began to talk, the words tumbling out in a torrent, a confession that had been held back for far too long. He told me how lost he'd felt after Sarah, how the world had felt gray and meaningless. He told me that coming home to me, to the quiet stability of our life, was the only thing that felt real. He admitted that the movie nights, the cuddling, the closeness, it wasn't accidental. He sought it out. He needed it. He needed me. He said that in all the chaos of his life falling apart, I was the one constant, the one person who made him feel safe. I didn't understand what I was feeling, he said, his voice raw. I've never felt this way about a guy before. I didn't know what to do with it. It felt good, and it felt right, but it scared the hell out of me. Because what if it meant I was different? What would people say? And what if I ruined the most important friendship I have ever had in my entire life? He looked at me, his face a portrait of desperation. That kiss, it wasn't a mistake, Leo. It was the most honest thing I've done in months. And the second I did it, I panicked. I felt like I had just set off a bomb, and I didn't know if it would destroy just me or both of us. So I ran. And I have been so miserable all week, living in this house without you. It's been worse than any breakup. His confession hung in the air between us, raw and beautiful and heartbreakingly honest. He had laid his terrified, confused heart at my feet. All the pain and anger of the past week dissolved, washed away by the sheer force of his vulnerability. He wasn't rejecting me. He was just as scared as I had been for the last 10 years. He was afraid of the same thing, losing this. In that moment, I understood that we were both just standing on opposite sides of the same door, too afraid to turn the knob. I closed the small distance between us on the floor, and this time, when our knees touched, it wasn't an accident or a question. It was an anchor. I reached out and took his hand, my fingers lacing through his, a mirror of that secret touch under the blanket. But this time, it was in the light. He squeezed my hand, a desperate, grateful pressure. We didn't have all the answers. We didn't know what this meant for our future. But for the first time, we were looking at the truth of it together, and we weren't running away. The silence was finally, truly broken. And in its place, we began to build something new. That conversation on the floor of our hallway was not an end, but a beginning. It was the painful but necessary demolition of the old structure of our friendship so that we could start laying a new foundation, one built on the bedrock of honesty. There was no magical, instantaneous resolution. We didn't fall into each other's arms and declare our undying love. Instead, we just sat there, hands clasped, and we talked. We really talked, for the first time in what felt like years. We talked until the first pale, gray light of dawn began to creep through the windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. He talked about his fear and confusion, his lifelong assumptions about himself suddenly being called into question. I talked about my decade of hidden feelings, the quiet, persistent ache of loving him from a distance, my own terror of risking the most important relationship in my life. We laid all of our cards on the table, all of our secrets, all of our fears. It was messy and halting and at times painful, but it was real. The days that followed were tentative, a delicate process of learning a new language, a new choreography. The oppressive, anxious silence was gone, replaced by a quiet, watchful tenderness. We were both fragile, handling each other's feelings with a newfound reverence. The grand gestures of romance seen in movies were absent from our story. Our romance was built in the small, mundane moments. It was in the way he started making my coffee exactly how I liked it in the morning, without asking. It was in the way I would find myself reaching out to touch his arm as I passed him in the kitchen, a small, grounding gesture of affection. It was in a deliberate, intentional handhold while we finally sat on the couch again, watching a movie not as a pretext for closeness, but as a simple, shared experience. The couch was no longer an island of ambiguity. It was just our couch, a place of comfort that now belonged to us in a new and explicit way. The first time he kissed me again, it was a week later. We were standing in the kitchen, the late afternoon sun streaming through the window, bathing the room in a warm, golden light. He had just told a stupid joke, and I was laughing, a real, unrestrained laugh. He just watched me, a soft, wondering smile on his face. And then he stepped forward, cupped my face in his hands, and kissed me. This time, there was no hesitation, no fear. It was a kiss of certainty, of quiet joy. It was a statement. It said, "This is real. This is us." It was gentle and sure, and it felt like coming home. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we'd learned to create together. The quiet that had once been a space for hiding was now a space of profound communication and comfort. We could sit in the same room for hours, me editing photos and him reading, without saying a word, yet feeling more connected than ever before. We learned that intimacy wasn't always about grand declarations or passionate encounters. More often, it was about the simple, sacred act of sharing a space, of knowing that another soul was peacefully coexisting alongside your own. His bedroom door, which had been a symbol of our separation, was now almost always open. And one night, after a long, quiet evening of reading side by side in bed, he turned to me and asked, not with fear, but with a quiet, happy certainty, if I would stay. I did, and I have, every night since. There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. A quiet night on the couch, a throwaway comment, the simple, accidental touch of a knee. You don't realize their significance at the time. It's only in retrospect, when you trace the path of your life backward, that you see them for what they were. Turning points, quiet hinges upon which your entire world swung open into a new and unexpected room. For me, that moment was a sentence and a touch. It was the catalyst that forced us to stop speaking in the coded language of friendship and to start learning the terrifying, beautiful grammar of love. Our story isn't one of sudden, dramatic revelations. It's a story of a slow, patient discovery, of two people learning that the safest place in the world can be the quiet, certain space you build with someone else. We found our home not in a place, but in a presence, in the silent, steady rhythm of two hearts that had finally, after a long and winding journey, learned to beat as one.